Artificial intelligence has woven itself into the fabric of modern existence. It is quietly shaping decisions that profoundly impact human lives. It has gone from determining who receives a job interview to calculating criminal sentencing recommendations. It is moving from approving mortgage applications to diagnosing medical conditions. Algorithms increasingly serve as gatekeepers to opportunity, justice, and well-being. Yet, these systems, which are often perceived as objective and impartial, carry within them the biases, assumptions, and inequities of their creators and the data upon which they are fed. The promise of AI to transcend human limitations and deliver fair, consistent decisions at scale confronts a sobering reality. Without vigilant oversight and ethical design, these systems risk amplifying the very prejudices we hoped technology might help us overcome. Understanding and addressing algorithmic bias is not merely a technical challenge for data scientists and engineers. It is a moral imperative for anyone who recognizes that algorithms of today are architecting the society of tomorrow. In this session, I'll discuss and help to illuminate the hidden dimensions of AI bias. I will explore the tangible consequences and chart a path forward, which is more equitable algorithmic systems that serve all of humanity, not just the privileged few. Algorithmic bias operates as a silent architect, constructing invisible barriers and pathways that shape human outcomes, while evading conscious detection. Unlike explicit discrimination, which announces itself through overt prejudice, algorithmic bias embeds itself within mathematical models, masquerading as objectivity while perpetuating and sometimes amplifying societal inequities. The fundamental misconception plaguing public understanding of AI systems is the belief that algorithms are inherently neutral. This technological mysticism, the notion that mathematical operations transcend human bias, crumbles upon examination. Every AI system begins with human decisions, such as which problems to solve, what data to collect, how to define success, which variables to consider, and which to ignore. These foundational choices encode values, priorities, and worldviews into the algorithmic architecture. When engineers predominantly come from homogeneous backgrounds, maybe often white or male, or from economically privileged, or even from specific geographic regions, their blind spots become the system's blind spots. Their assumptions become the algorithm's assumptions. Historical bias represents the first category of algorithmic prejudice, occurring when training data, which accurately reflects historical inequities that we do not wish to perpetuate. Consider a hiring algorithm trained on historical employment data from a technology company. If that company's past hiring practices favored men for engineering positions, whether through explicit discrimination or systemic barriers, the algorithm learns to replicate this pattern. It will identify maleness as correlated with successful engineering candidates. AI has not invented discrimination. It has faithfully learned from discriminatory patterns in its training data. This creates a paradox. The more accurately an algorithm models historical reality, the more effectively it may perpetuate historical injustice. Representation bias emerges when training data sets fail to adequately represent the diversity of populations upon which the system will operate. Facial recognition systems trained predominantly on images of white faces demonstrate significantly higher error rates when identifying people with darker skin tones, particularly women of color. These disparities are not accidental oversights. They reflect whose faces were considered important enough to include in the training data set. They identify whose identities were deemed default and whose experiences were marginalized as edge cases. The consequences extend beyond inconvenience. When law enforcement agencies deploy these flawed systems, misidentification can lead to wrongful arrests, surveillance targeting, and erosion of civil liberties for already vulnerable communities. Measurement bias occurs when we choose, define, and measure the wrong constructs or use inappropriate proxies for the concept we actually care about. Predictive policing algorithms that forecast crime hotspots based on arrest records do not measure crime. They measure police activity. In neighborhoods with heavier policing, more arrests occur, creating data that directs even more police resources to those areas. This is a self-fulfilling prophecy that reflects enforcement patterns rather than actual crime rates. Similarly, using credit scores as proxies for financial responsibility fails to account for how systemic economic disadvantages limit credit access for marginalized communities. And that creates algorithmic systems that punish poverty rather than assessing genuine risk. Aggregation bias arises when a single model attempts to serve diverse populations with different needs or characteristics. Medical algorithms trained primarily on data from certain demographic groups may fail to generalize to others. A widely used algorithm for managing chronic care prioritized white patients over black patients with identical health condition because it used healthcare spending as a proxy for health needs. Since black patients historically have less access to healthcare and consequently generate lower spending, the algorithm incorrectly concluded they were healthier, thus denying them appropriate interventions. The lesson is clear. One-size-fits-all algorithms inevitably fit some better than others. Evaluation bias manifests when testing and validation process fail to adequately assess system performance across all affected populations. Developers may test algorithms on benchmark datasets that do not reflect real-world diversity, or may prioritize overall accuracy metrics that obscure disparate performance across subgroups. An algorithm with 95% overall accuracy sounds impressive, but if it achieves 98% accuracy for majority groups and only 80% for minority groups, that aggregate statistic marks harmful inequity. Feedback loops and bias amplification represents perhaps the most insidious form of algorithmic bias. When AI systems inform decisions that generate new data used to retrain the system, biases compound over time. A resume screening algorithm that initially exhibits mild gender bias will recommend fewer women for interviews. If hiring managers trust these recommendations, fewer women get hired. The algorithm then observes that women are less frequently hired. It will interpret this as a validation of its initial bias, which strengthens the subsequent iterations. This creates a runaway feedback loops where small initial biases amplify into substantial systemic discrimination. For professionals designing algorithms, understanding this bias mechanism connects directly to security governance, to risk management, and ethical frameworks. Algorithm bias represents a significant risk vector. In fact, it's one that threatens organizational reputation, regulatory compliance, and most importantly, the well-being of individuals affected by these systems. The explosion of data that powers modern AI systems, these are the celebrated data deluge, it brings us both unprecedented analytical capabilities and unprecedented opportunities for bias to infiltrate algorithmic decision making. So understanding where bias conceals itself within data ecosystem is essential for developing effective mitigation strategies. Training data collection represents the first critical juncture where bias enters. The data we collect reflects the priorities, the resources, and perspectives of those doing the collection. Medical research data sets have historically overrepresented men, leading to diagnostic algorithms less accurate for women's health conditions. Voice recognition systems trained primarily on standard American English accents will struggle with speakers of other languages or dialects, thereby creating barriers for immigrants and linguistic minorities. The apparently simple question of what data should we collect encodes profound decisions about whose experiences count. It shows whose voices matter and whose needs deserve technological accommodation. Historical data poisoning occurs when past discrimination contaminates data sets in ways that are not immediately obvious. Criminal justice data sets contain not objective records of criminal behavior, but rather records of arrest, of prosecution and conviction processes, suffused with documented racial bias. So using such data to predict risk inevitably bakes historical discrimination into algorithmic predictions. Similarly, educational data sets reflecting standardized test scores may capture not student potential but rather socio-economic advantages like access to test preparation, resources, stable housing, and adequate nutrition. Training algorithms on those markers risks mistaking privilege for merit. Sampling bias emerges when training data does not represent the population upon which the algorithm will operate. Online data sets overrepresent populations with internet access, digital literacy, and time to generate online content. And these are typically younger, more educated, more affluent demographics. Recommendation algorithms trained on such data may fail to serve or may actively disadvantage offline populations. Medical AI trained on data from wealthy nations may not generalize to resource-limited settings where disease presentations differ due to nutrition, environmental factors, and comorbidities. Label bias contaminate data sets when human annotators encode their own biases into the labels used to train supervised learning systems. When humans label images, text, or other data, their subjective judgments influenced by cultural assumptions, stereotypes, and incomplete understanding become ground truth for the algorithm. Studies have documented how image labeling reflects gender stereotypes, associating women with domestic settings and men with professional environments. Natural language processing systems trained on human labeled text learn to associate certain names with criminality, it associates certain accents with intelligence, and it associates certain neighborhoods with danger. Not because these associations are accurate, but because human labelers encoded these prejudices. Proxy discrimination represents a particularly insidious form of data bias where algorithms use seemingly neutral variables that correlate with protected characteristics to achieve discriminatory outcomes. When systems explicitly exclude protected attributes like race, gender, or age, they can achieve the same discriminatory effects through proxies. For example, zip codes correlate with racial decomposition due to residential segregation. First names correlate with gender, ethnicity, and social economic status. Educational institution correlates with wealth. So algorithms that include these variables can discriminate without ever explicitly considering protected characteristics, which is a form of bias laundering that evades even well-intentioned oversight. Temporal bias arises because data ages and the relationships algorithms learn from historical data may not hold true in changing contexts. An algorithm trained on pre-pandemic employment patterns may fail catastrophically when applied to post-pandemic labor markets. Credit scoring models developed during economic expansion may prove inequitable during recession. The assumption that patterns will remain stable statistically, stationarity often fails in complex, evolving social systems. Yet, many algorithms operate as if the future will perfectly mirror the past. Interaction and intersectionality add layers of complexity to data bias. This is because individuals exist at intersections of multiple identities, which could be race, gender, age, disability, sexual orientation, and socioeconomic status. So these intersections create unique experiences that simple demographic categories fail to capture. A system that performs adequately for women and adequately for minorities may still fail for women who are also minorities. Data sparsity at these intersections means algorithms have less information to learn from, and that leads to higher error rates for the most marginalized individuals. The very communities that could benefit from most equitable algorithmic decision making often receive the least accurate, most biased outcomes. Data documentation and provenance challenges complicate bias detection and mitigation. Many data sets used in AI development lack comprehensive documentation about their origins, about their collection methods, about known limitations, and appropriate use cases. Data sheets for data sets, standardized documentations will remain aspirational rather than standard practice. So without clear provenance, developers cannot assess whether training data contains biases relevant to the application. Datasets often get repurposed for applications far removed from their original collection purpose. So what it does that introduces mismatches between data characteristics and development contexts that create unexpected biases. The scale paradox represents a final data challenge. So as data sets grow to internet scale, proportions, comprehensive auditing becomes computationally and practically infeasible. Training data sets for large language models contain billions of text samples scraped from the internet, which is a popular information source, and is notorious for containing offensive, inaccurate, and biased content. Manually reviewing such data sets is impossible. Yet, automated filtering introduces its own biases based on what content is flagged as problematic. In essence, the very scale that makes modern AI powerful simultaneously makes it opaque and difficult to audit for bias. Another problem is that the data deluge problem connects to several domains such as security assessments and testing, and requires understanding of data quality and validation, security operations, which involves monitoring systems for unexpected behaviors that may indicate bias. It will also involve software development, security, which also encompasses secure and ethical data handling throughout the development life cycle. The consequences of algorithmic bias extend far beyond abstract ethical concerns, manifesting in tangible harms that damage lives, it perpetuates injustice, and erode trust in institutions. Examining real-world cases illuminates the urgent need for addressing these issues. Criminal justice has emerged as one of the most troubling domains for biased algorithms. A ProPublica's investigation revealed that an algorithm used for profiling criminals and justice system incorrectly flagged black defendants as high risk at nearly twice the rate it incorrectly flagged white defendants. While white defendants were more often labeled as low risk, so these errors have profound consequences. People were denied bail, people remain incarcerated while awaiting trial, people were losing jobs, housing, and family stability because of being incarcerated. People who are assessed as high risk will receive higher and harsher sentences, and algorithms bias doesn't merely predict disparate outcomes, it actively creates them. It channels individuals into criminal justice systems grip based on racially discriminatory assessments masquerading as objective risk scores. The implications extend beyond individual cases to systemic reinforcement of mass incarceration. When biased algorithms direct resources, attention, and scrutiny towards communities of color, they perpetuate cycles of over-policing and criminalization that have devastated these communities for generations. The promise of algorithmic objectivity has been weaponized to legitimize discrimination, with judges and prosecutors citing computer-generated risk scores as if they were scientifically rigorous, when in fact they encode historical prejudices. Employment discrimination through algorithmic hiring systems denies opportunities based on biased criteria. Amazon's experimental recruiting tool, which was trained on resumes submitted over a 10-year period, taught itself to penalize resumes containing words associated with women, such as women's chairs, club captain, or graduates of women's colleges. The system reflected the male-dominated composition of Amazon's technical workforce. It learned to favor men by proxy. Though Amazon ultimately scrapped the system, the incident illustrates how easily hiring algorithms can perpetuate workforce homogeneity under the guise of meritocratic selection. LinkedIn's advertising platform was found to show job postings for high-paying positions more frequently to men than to women, even when both groups had identical qualifications and browsing behaviors. So this creates a self-reinforcing cycle where women receive fewer opportunities to see and apply for lucrative positions, leading to lower representation in high-paying roles, which algorithms then interpret as evidence that women are less suitable for those positions. The economic consequences are substantial, and it contributes to consistent wage gaps and occupational segregation. Healthcare disparities amplified by biased algorithms threaten patient well-being and perpetuate health inequities. The algorithm used to identify patients needing additional medical care significantly underestimated the needs of Black patients, assigning them lower risk scores than equally sick white patients. This occurred because the algorithm used healthcare costs as proxy for health needs and failing to account for systemic barriers to healthcare access faced by Black patients. The consequence of that is where approximately 50% fewer Black patients were identified for care management programs designed to address complex medical needs. This is not a minor technical glitch. It is a system that systematically denies care to those who need it most, coded into mathematical form. Diagnostic algorithms trained primarily on data from certain populations may misdiagnose or fail to recognize conditions in others. For example, pulse oximeters used to measure blood oxygen levels have been shown to overestimate oxygen saturation in patients with darker skin pigmentation, potentially delaying treatments for hypoxemia. As machine learning systems for medical diagnosis proliferate, ensuring equitable performance across diverse patient populations becomes a life or death issue. Algorithmic underwriting systems that rely on alternative data sources such as social media activity, smartphone usage patterns, and online behavior may inadvertently discriminate based on factors correlated with protected characteristics. For example, someone with a less favorable social network determined algorithmically might be denied credit despite strong repayment capacity. These systems risk creating a digital redlining that excludes entire communities from financial services based on algorithmic assessments that lack transparency or accountability. The use of AI in insurance prices raises similar concerns. Algorithms Algorithms that adjust premiums based on proxy variables may charge higher rates to protected groups without explicitly considering prohibited characteristics. The opacity of these systems makes it difficult for consumers to understand why they were charged certain rates or to challenge potentially discriminatory practices. Educational opportunities limited by biased algorithms shape students' future from an early age. This is because look at automated proctoring systems that are used to monitor students during online exams. It has been criticized for higher false positive rates in flagging cheating among students of color, leading to unfair academic penalties. Algorithmic college admission systems that where certain high schools, neighborhoods, or extracurricular activities may systematically disadvantage students from under-resourced communities. Adaptive learning systems that adjust difficulty based on early performance may trap students in lower level content, limiting their educational advancement based on initial assessments that may reflect test anxiety. Or it may also reflect language barriers or unfamiliarity with testing formats rather than the actual ability of the student. Content moderation bias on social media platforms disproportionately affects marginalized communities. Automated systems designed to remove hate speech and harassment have been found to flag content from Black users discussing racism at higher rates than actual hate speech from white supremacists. This occurs partly because models trained on text containing references to marginalized identities flag those references as potentially problematic, unable to distinguish between hateful usage and community discussion. You know the result? The very communities targeted online by online harassment face additional silencing through biased content moderation, while actual hate speech evades detection. Housing discrimination perpetuated through algorithmic systems will deny people access to safe, affordable housing. Targeted advising algorithms have been shown to display housing ads in ways that correlate with race, showing certain neighborhoods primarily to white users and others primarily to Black users. Rental application screening algorithms that consider criminal records, credit scores, or eviction history disproportionately exclude people of color due to documented disparities in these systems. Algorithmic landlords that set rent prices based on demand prediction may effectively price out marginalized communities from gentrifying neighborhoods. The cumulative burden of algorithmic bias weighs most heavily on those already facing systemic disadvantage. A person might be flagged as high risk by a predictive policing algorithm. A person may be denied employment by a biased hiring system. Someone could be rejected for a credit by a discriminatory lending algorithm and excluded from quality healthcare by a flawed medical risk predictor. It's all based on the same underlying biases cascading through multiple algorithmic systems. This creates compounding disadvantage where algorithmic decisions in one domain affect opportunities in others. What it does is that it traps individuals in cycles of exclusion. So real world harm illustrates that security extends beyond protecting systems from external threats to ensuring that systems don't harm the populations they are meant to serve. There should be organizational responsibility for ethical operations and regulatory adherence. Algorithmic bias creates legal liability under anti-discrimination status. Regulatory exposure, it also creates regulatory exposure under emerging AI governance frameworks and reputational damage that can prove catastrophic. So now let me discuss some of the strategies for mitigating and addressing algorithmic bias. To mitigate that, it requires comprehensive strategies that spans across technical interventions to organizational practices and regulatory frameworks. While no single solution will eliminate algorithmic bias entirely, a multi-layered approach will significantly mitigate harm and promote more equitable systems. Diverse and representative development teams will constitute the foundational defense against algorithmic bias. Homogeneous teams will share blind spots. Diverse teams will bring varied perspectives that may identify potential biases early in development. Research demonstrates that diverse teams will produce more innovative solutions and identify edge cases that homogeneous teams may overlook. So organizations must move beyond superficial diversity initiatives to creating genuinely inclusive environments where team members from underrepresented groups feel empowered to raise concern about potential biases without the fear of dismissal or retaliation. Achieving this will require not just diverse hiring, but also inclusive culture, equitable advancement opportunities, and leadership representation. It will also require comprehensive data auditing and documentation that can provide visibility into potential bias sources. So before deploying any AI systems, teams should conduct thorough audits examining training data demographics, representation across subgroups, potential proxy variables, historical biases, and data provenance. Standardized documentation templates will help developers understand data characteristics and limitations. Model cards document AI systems performance, its intended use cases, its limitation and known biases that will enable downstream users to make informed decisions about appropriate applications. So such transparency too will transform the opaque black boxes into documented systems with clear capabilities and constraints. Also, fairness and algorithmic auditing will enable quantitative assessment of disparate impacts. Multiple mathematical definitions of fairness exist, such as it affects demographic parity, equalized odds, calibration, individual fairness, and choosing appropriate metrics will depend on application context and stakeholder values. Organizations should establish clear fairness criteria before development. They should have a regularly audit deploy systems against those criteria, and they should be prepared to make trade-offs when different fairness definitions conflict. Automated fairness testing tools like IBM's AI Fairness 360, Google's What If tool, and Microsoft's Fairlane provide frameworks for measuring and mitigating bias. They make such practice more accessible to development teams. Disaggregated evaluation requires assessing system performance separately for different demographic groups rather than relying solely on aggregate metrics. For example, an algorithm with 95% overall accuracy might have 98% accuracy for one group and 85% accuracy for another group. So a disparity obscured by aggregate statistics, that's what it will be. Intersectional analysis will examine performance for individuals at the intersection of multiple identities, revealing biases that single axis analysis will miss. Such granular evaluation should extend throughout the development life cycle, from training data validation through post-development monitoring. Bias monitoring techniques operate at different stages of the machine learning pipeline. So pre-processing interventions will modify training data to reduce bias through techniques such as resampling to balance representation. It will reweigh to adjust sample importance or data augmentation to increase minority group samples. Processing methods modify learning algorithms themselves, adding fairness constraint to optimization objective, or using adversarial debiasing to remove discriminatory patterns. Post-processing approaches will adjust model outputs to satisfy fairness criteria, such as adjusting decision thresholds differently for different groups. Each approach has trade-offs between fairness, accuracy, and applicability to different contexts. However, explainable AI is not a panacea for explanation themselves. They can be misleading, and the interpretability sometimes trades off against accuracy. Too often, AI systems are designed for people without those people's input. So participatory approaches will engage stakeholders in defining problems, in establishing fairness criteria, in evaluating prototypes, and interpreting results. Such democratization of AI development will help to ensure such democratization of AI development will help to ensure systems serve genuine community needs rather than designers' assumptions about those needs. Community oversight boards, algorithmic impact assessments, and public comment periods on high stakes AI deployments provide mechanisms for meaningful participation. Continuous monitoring and feedback loops, they will detect emerging biases post deployment. Systems that appear fair during development may develop biases as data distribution shifts or as feedback loops amplify small initial disparities. This is why organizations should implement ongoing monitoring dashboards, tracking fairness metrics across demographic groups, which will alert systems for concerning trends, and regular evaluation schedules. User feedback mechanisms will allow affected individuals to report suspected biases. It will help to create bottom-up accountability alongside top-down auditing. Red teaming and adversarial testing will proactively search for vulnerabilities and biases. Teams specifically tasked with breaking systems, finding edge cases, and identifying potential harms will provide critical stress testing before deployment. Adversarial examples such as inputs deliberately crafted to fool algorithms will reveal brittleness and bias in unexpected ways. Bug bounty programs will incentivize external researchers to identify biases and vulnerabilities, thereby leveraging diverse perspectives beyond internal teams. Algorithmic impact assessments will evaluate potential harms before high stakes deployments. That will be similar to environmental impact assessment. And these systematic evaluations will examine who might be affected by the system, what harms could occur, what mitigation strategies exist, and whether deployment is justified. given risks. All these suggested assessments should be public. It should allow external scrutiny of systems affecting public welfare. Several jurisdictions have begun requiring such assessments for government use of AI in consequential decisions. Human-in-the-loop design will maintain meaningful human oversight over algorithmic decisions. So rather than fully automated decision-making, hybrid systems will present algorithmic recommendation that humans evaluate before finalization. This will work best when humans are trained to critically evaluate recommendation rather than defer automatically to computer outputs. Automation bias can lead humans to rubber stamp algorithmic decisions without proper scrutiny. So this is where effective human oversight will require explainable recommendations. It will need time for thoughtful evaluation and organizational cultures that reward careful judgment over processing speed. I know that most organizations will reward processing speed, but that processing speed may come at the cost of algorithmic bias. Contestability mechanisms will empower individuals to challenge algorithmic decisions affecting them. People should be able to request human review, receive explanations for decisions, present additional information not considered by the algorithm, and appeal unfavorable outcomes. Such procedural protection would align with due process principles, and it will create accountability, feedback, helping organizations in identifying and correcting systemic biases. Using ethical frameworks and governance structures will institutionalize responsible AI practices. Ethics review boards will evaluate proposed projects for potential harms. There will be clear policies established when AI should and when AI should not be used. There should be training programs to educate all team members, not just technical staff, on bias recognition and mitigation. Executive leadership should support signals that ethical AI is organizational priority. It's not just a compliance box checking. For organizations trying to integrate algorithmic fairness into maybe security frameworks, they should ensure ethical considerations that receive the same systemic attention as technical security controls. Regulatory compliance and legal frameworks can create external accountability. For example, the European Union's AI Act proposes risk-based regulation with strict requirements for high-risk applications. Several UN jurisdictions have passed or proposed algorithmic accountability law. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission has issued guidance on AI hiring. As regulation evolves, organizations must stay current with legal obligations while recognizing that legal compliance represents a flaw, not a ceiling. Ethical AI often requires going beyond minimal legal requirements. So our collective responsibility is to challenge the bias in algorithms. The challenge of algorithmic bias extends far beyond technical solutions. It demands a fundamental reckoning with the role of technology in society and our collective responsibility for ensuring that it serves human flourishing rather than perpetuating injustice. For everyday people, understanding algorithmic bias is essential digital literacy in an age where algorithm mediates access to opportunity. You need not become a data scientist to recognize that algorithmic systems affect your life and to demand accountability from organizations deploying them. When you are denied a loan or rejected for a job, unfairly targeted by a predictive system, you have the right to ask why, to understand what factors influence the decision, and to context outcomes that seem unjust. You should be able to support organizations and platforms that prioritize transparency and fairness. You should advocate for your representatives to enact strong algorithmic accountability legislation. You can also share stories of algorithmic harms within your communities. Such narratives combat the myth of algorithmic objectivity and can build a momentum for change. It should teach children and young people to think critically about AI systems. They should be able to question rather than blindly trust algorithmic recommendations. For this generation that is growing up with AI powered everything, they must develop healthy skepticism about technological authority. They must be able to understand that behind every algorithm lie human choices and values that may or may not align with justice and equity. So for technology enthusiasts and developers, your passion for innovation carries profound ethical responsibility. Every line of code you write, every data set you curate, every model you train makes choices about what interest matters, whose experience counts, and whose welfare deserves consideration. I implore you to treat ethics not as a constraint or innovation, but as essential to building technological genuinity worthy of the enthusiasm you bring. Learn about fairness metrics, bias mitigation techniques, and responsible AI frameworks. I implore you to question assumptions embedded in project requirements. You should be able to advocate for diverse teams and inclusive design processes. You can refuse to build systems whose harms you cannot justify, because the most brilliant algorithm means nothing if it perpetuates injustice. True innovation lies not in technical sophistication alone, but in creating systems that expand rather than constrain human potential. It will be the one that empowers rather than exclude. It will be the one that heals rather than harm. So your technical expertise positions you to be either part of the problem or part of the solution. Choose deliberately. For security professionals, remember that security encompasses not just protecting systems from external threats, but it also includes ensuring systems don't harm those they are meant to serve. So incorporate bias assessments into security testing and validation processes. Treat algorithmic fairness as a security requirement deserving the same rigor as confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Include bias incidents in incident response planning and security metrics. Your expertise in risk assessment, threat modeling, and security governance translates directly to algorithmic accountability. Threat modeling should consider bias as an attack vector. Both unintentional bias from flawed design and intentional bias injected through data poisoning or adversarial manipulation. Risk assessments should qualify potential harms from biased algorithms alongside traditional security risk. Security policies should mandate fairness testing and diverse development teams. The holistic approach to security as security professionals will position you to champion ethical AI within your organization. For organizations and executives, algorithmic bias represents strategic risk demanding board-level attention. Reputational damage from bias scandals can be catastrophic. Consider Amazon's bias hiring tool. Consider Compass radically discriminating risk scores and healthcare algorithms denying care to Black patients, all generated significant negative press and stakeholder backlash. Legal liability under anti-discriminatory laws creates financial exposure. Regulatory penalties will increase as AI governance frameworks mature. But beyond these instrumental concerns, organizations have moral obligations to stakeholders not to cause harm through their operations, but they have to build ethical AIs that requires investment, that requires diverse teams, fairness testing, infrastructure, ongoing monitoring, and stakeholder engagements. This type of investment pays dividend through trust, brand value, and sustainable operations. Short-term cost savings from neglecting bias mitigation. It will pay against long-term cost of discrimination, lawsuits, regulatory penalties, and reputational crisis. So integrate algorithmic fairness into corporate governance structures, assign executive accountability, establish ethics, review processes, and be transparent with stakeholders about AI uses and known limitations. Because there are limitations in the use of AI. It's not all positive all the way. For researchers and academics, remember your work shapes the trajectory of AI development through the techniques you invent, the problems you prioritize, and the values you embed in such research agendas. Fairness, accountability, and transparency research has exploded in recent years, producing valuable tools and frameworks. Continue this essential work while resisting pressures to treat bias as purely technical problem divorced from social context. Employ you to partner with affected communities, with social scientists, ethicists, and domain experts. Don't just publish in computer science venues, but also publish your concerns in interdisciplinary forums, reaching broader audiences. Make tools and data sets available to practitioners. Resist corporate influence that may steer research away from finding inconvenient to business models built on data extraction and automated decision making. I want you to question the assumption that every problem deserves algorithmic solution. Some decisions such as bail determination, child welfare investigation, medical diagnosis may involve such high stakes and such contextual nuance that automation, however fair we attempt to make it, will remain inappropriate. Research should address not just how do we make this algorithm fairer, but also should we build this algorithm at all? For policymakers and regulators, the accelerating deployment of consequential AI systems demand urgent action to establish guardrails protecting public welfare. Algorithmic accountability legislation should require impact assessments for high-risk applications. It should mandate transparency and explainability. It should establish contestability rights. It should prohibit certain high-risk uses and create enforcement mechanisms with meaningful penalties. Regulation should be risk-based, focusing insight on consequential domains like criminal justice, like employment, housing, credit, and healthcare, while avoiding stifling innovation in lower stakes applications. It should include civil society organizations, should include affected communities and ethics experts alongside industry representatives in policy development. Research should be funded on fairness, accountability, and transparency. It should support public sector capacity for algorithmic auditing and enforcement. International cooperation is also essential because AI systems transcend borders and regulatory arbitrage could undermine protections. Work towards harmonized standards while recognizing that different cultural contexts may prioritize different values. Support developing nations in building AI governance capacity, in preventing algorithmic colonialism, where systems developed for wealthy nations are developed in resource-limited settings without adaptation or oversight. So the path forward requires cultural transformation in how we conceive of and develop AI systems. We must abandon the myth of algorithmic objectivity, the seductive but dangerous belief that mathematical operations transcend human bias. Every algorithm embodies choices, values, and priorities. Acknowledging this doesn't diminish AI's potential. It only clarifies our responsibility for ensuring that those potentials serves justice rather than perpetuating harm. We must resist technological solutionism that reflects to treat every societal problem as solvable through technical means. Some challenges require political will. It requires resource distribution and systemic change that algorithms cannot provide. Technology can support these efforts, but it should not substitute for addressing root causes of inequity. We must cultivate ethical reflexivity, the habit of questioning our assumptions, examining whose interests our systems serve, and remaining open to discovering that even well-intentioned projects may cause harm. This requires humility from the technical experts who are accustomed to seeing technology as neutral progress. The stakes cannot be higher. The algorithmic systems deployed today are creating precedents and path dependencies that will shape society for generations. So, biased algorithms don't just reflect existing inequities, they actively perpetuate and amplify them by creating self-fulfilling prophecies where discrimination becomes embodied in seemingly objective technical infrastructure. Yet the systems that carry such risk also hold genuine potential for good when designed and deployed responsibly. The choice before us is clear. We can allow algorithms to blindly perpetuate and amplify historical injustices, or we can deliberately design systems that advance equity and justice. This choice cannot be delegated to developers alone, or to ethicists alone, or to policymakers alone. It requires collective action from everyone whose lives are touched by AI, which is to say, everyone. The work begins with awareness, advances through education, and manifests through action. So I implore you to read, learn, question, advocate, build, regulate, resist whatever your role. You have both power and responsibility to shape how AI develops. The algorithms of today are constructing the society of tomorrow. Let us ensure it is a society we can be proud to inhabit. Let us ensure it is one where technology serves justice, where it amplifies opportunity and honors the dignity of every human being. The invisible enemy of algorithmic bias can be defeated, but only if we choose to fight. That fight begins now, with each of us in every decision we make about how to design, develop, evaluate, regulate, and use algorithmic systems to increasingly mediate our world. The future is not yet written. Let us write it together with intention, with ethics, and with unwavering commitment to justice. That's my take on ethical AI. I'd like to know what you think.